Well, welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. I am, as usual, Jodelle. And you know what? Dr. Raymond Peat is back on the podcast. He's with me again, and he needs no introduction for most of you that follow my podcast. We are some Ray Peat lovers here. But if you do want to learn about Dr. Peat and you're new to the podcast, I invite you to check out his amazingly informational, chock full of information website, raypeat.com. That's RAYPEAT.com. And we're going to dive right in because I want to thank all of you who submitted questions for Dr. Peat. I think both he and I really enjoy answering these questions, and I love hearing his input on them. So we are going to jump right in. Dr. Peat, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with my own question that I have for you that I've been really curious to know about. I kind of put mine at the top of the list here. But what are your thoughts on Chinese medicine and something that I'm learning about called liver heat? Now, I'm not trained in Chinese medicine, but I love learning Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and applying it to my clientele and to myself. And I was wondering your thoughts on how to achieve good liver balance, and if you feel that liver heat or liver stagnation is actually an issue in a lot of people.
Yeah, the Chinese over thousands of years accumulated lots of good knowledge, but the idea of Chinese traditional medicine it isn't a monolithic thing. It varies by regions, for example. So there are many traditional Chinese medicines, and I think many of them are somewhat useless or maybe even harmful, but they do have probably, in total, there's probably more useful medication available in Chinese medicine than in American pharmaceutical oriented medicine, just because it's such a vast field of knowledge. But it's based on basically natural substances, and a lot of the knowledge is metaphoric. Like when I was in Mexico, I learned that the plants that were, for example, something that was prescribed for anemia in different areas. It happened that when you cooked up the leaves or twigs or whatever, they were plants that produced a bright red solution, even though they were hugely different chemicals. It was the connection between the redness of the herb and the perceived lack of redness of the blood of an anemic person. So it wasn't scientific at all, and if it happened to work, it was really just accidental. And so those things, if you have hundreds of people doing that, sometimes you'll hit on a drug that works, and that'll be preserved. So it'll be something that started as a metaphor, but turned out to have empirical value.
Okay. And as far as like the liver heat, when in Chinese medicine they talk about liver heat as like liver inflammation or liver stagnation, what say you about that?
The gut and the liver are really our basic, deepest interaction with the world of chemistry and nutrition, and it happens that the liver is necessarily involved in all of our chemical reactions, and you can say that fixing the liver is going to improve every condition. But the way they go about fixing the liver is, again, sometimes very metaphorical and sometimes unscientific, but very often, if you attend to the liver, you're very often going to get things right.
Mm-hmm, for sure. What's one of your top tips for if somebody knows they have liver inflammation or some sort of liver issue going on? What would you say would be the first line of defense for them?
Laxatives and anti-inflammatory substances, because irritation of the bowel necessarily produces irritation of the liver. The bowel is constantly either protecting the liver from toxins or letting them through into the liver. So if your intestine is inflamed and not working very well, it's going to hurt your liver. So laxatives and anti-inflammatories are the first defense of the liver.
Okay, good to know. Now, one other question I had was there's a lot out there on mono diets where somebody's just going to use one food or substance to cleanse the body. And I've recently come across one that I think you might approve of. Since you are a big fan of milk, there's something coming out in the biotoxic illness community called a milk cleanse, where this is a mono diet where somebody would only drink milk for 8 days. Well, what are your thoughts on that? What do you think about that?
Sometimes it's extended to a month.
Okay.
And it can be very powerful because the milk contains antibiotic ingredients and multiple anti-inflammatory, sedative, as well as nutritional substances. And really the only thing it lacks to live on for a year is iron. An adult living on pure milk for more than a month is likely to start noticing an iron deficiency. So it's just profoundly therapeutic to do it for a week or more, up to a month.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's really intriguing because when you think about it, milk has all the macronutrients. It has fat, it has protein, it has carbohydrates. So you're not really fasting in any sense because you're getting all your macros, and it's got tons of minerals in it. So yeah, when I was thinking about it, I'm like, that makes a really good sense as far as being a really good mono diet or cleanse.
And since stress generally increases inflammation, and that turns on the angiotensin system that activates the adrenals and aldosterone, and that activates the parathyroid glands, and the parathyroids turn off respiratory energy production as a way of hiding from stress. The way serotonin is closely involved in aldosterone and parathyroid hormone, and serotonin is an important factor on turning on hibernation, turning off metabolic energy. And since high calcium intake turns off the parathyroid gland, it restores energy production, and most people are running around stressed to the degree that their parathyroid and angiotensin and aldosterone, serotonin systems are unnecessarily active, and so it is equivalent to being hypothyroid. When the stress turns off your metabolism, it does exactly what hypothyroidism does. And calcium in sufficient amounts, like on a pure milk diet, that's going to very strongly inhibit your parathyroid hormone, meaning that it very strongly increases your metabolic rate, gets your liver active, providing stabilized glucose and detoxifying processes, so that any accumulated toxins from your fat and other tissues will be very efficiently detoxified and excreted. So a pure milk diet is very similar to giving adequate thyroid supplementation to get the whole energy system and detoxifying system going again.
Oh, wow. I'm so glad I asked this question because to truth be told, lay everything on the table. I actually did this cleanse, this 8-day cleanse. I've done it twice now with raw goat's milk. And in 8 days, I've had better results with my health than I've had trying to get past this toxic mold exposure for the last 4 years. So I completely agree with you that this type of approach is healing on many levels, the liver, the thyroid, because I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. And I'm going to be podcasting about it soon too with the creator that put together this little milk cleanse that I specifically did. So I just wanted your 2 cents, and I'm so glad I asked.
I have a friend who has a lot of big dogs, and his grandkids have some goats that they milk and sell the goat milk. Mm-hmm. So there's always a generous amount of goat milk. And over the last several years, when he discovered the good effects of milk on himself and friends, he had a dog that was injured almost fatally in a fight. Mm-hmm. And he gave it sugar for immediate recovery, but then gave it a pure milk diet, and it recovered very fast. So that started him being interested in the therapeutic properties. And in one of the fights, a dog's eyeball was bitten and deflated and disappeared. So there was just a red socket. Mm. And he put that dog on a pure milk diet, and I guess it was 3 or 4 weeks. He noticed in this empty red socket, he noticed what looked like a cornea or lens developing, and over a period of 6 weeks or 2 months, mm-hmm. A new eyeball appeared.
Oh, wow.
And with a couple of old dogs who had gone blind from cataracts, he put them on the milk diet, and they recovered from their cataracts. So the fresh goat milk was apparently responsible for regenerating, in one case, a whole eyeball, in the other, restoring clarity to the lenses.
Okay, so then the cliche stands, milk really does do a body good. So yeah, I think we've heard it here, folks. You can definitely try a mono diet of milk. Well, I think we'll jump into the next question. So this is from SM. It says, could you please ask Dr. Peat how you would know if you are taking too much thyroid supplement? For example, I'm taking 1 whole tablet a day of Sinoplus split into 3 doses and half a tablet of Sinomel split into 2 doses. My underarm temperature is around 98 degrees Fahrenheit and resting heart rate around 60 beats per minute. I generally feel a bit fatigued, wondering if I should up the dose, and how would I know if I'm taking too much? So I guess the question is, how do you know if you're taking too much or too little, Dr. Peat?
A few times, for example, if I was taking a 2-grain dose of Armour Thyroid during the winter, every spring I found that I started overheating and getting out of breath if I kept taking that amount. So I learned that in the spring I had to go from 2 grains down to a half a grain. Mm-hmm. And what you are most likely to notice when you're taking more than enough is that you're just standing up and walking across the room, for example, you'll feel increased warmth and you'll be breathing harder and temporarily get out of breath just for walking 30 feet or so. So your heart beats very powerfully and quickly, usually going 95 or 100 beats per minute with a very hard, firm pulse, not a rapid, weak beat. And you're very easily overheated and get out of breath, but you also recover your breath quickly.
Okay, some good symptoms to look for there then, SM. Okay, so Upkar Beacom asks whether succinate is a source, whether a succinate source of vitamin E is acceptable to consume. Now, when I looked into succinate a while back, that source seems to be really good for cancer prevention. Yeah, I had just seen some studies on it relating to cancer, but as far as if it's safe or acceptable to consume, that's something that I guess I'll have to look into a bit further.
The vitamin E should be described according to its actual composition.
Okay.
As tocopherol, which of the isomers of the tocopherol it is.
Okay, good to know. Okay, White Lotus asks, I found 3 masses in my breast along with a 2 centimeter mass in my lymph node via ultrasound. And reading further down, she has a pretty low TSH and T4 within range. But it seems to be her numbers are getting worse now. An ultrasound showed an enlarged thyroid, but otherwise normal. Then she learned about you and she started taking her temperature and implementing kind of the way that you describe eating. And her temperature is 97.4 in the morning, and it can get to 98.4 midday. Her adrenals seem to be involved because her pulse goes from 84 to 94 to 110, 135 when she's stressed, and will sometimes go up and down within the few seconds that she's taking the pulse. And ever since COVID, it seems her heart rate is unstable. She can feel a change when she takes progesterone and thyroid, and she started aspirin, but it might irritate her stomach sometimes. Would she still be considered hypothyroid even though her TSH is so low and T4 is high? And should she continue on the protocol? Yeah, go ahead.
What exactly was her TSH number? Do you have it?
Yeah, 0.35.
0.25?
0.35.
That's it's not inconsistent with hypothyroidism.
Okay.
So experimenting with the dose is important, but you don't respond properly to the thyroid supplement if your body is very saturated with polyunsaturated fats, or if your diet contains polyunsaturated fats,
for sure.
or if you're getting too much phosphate in the diet from meat or fish, or nuts or legumes or grains, will interfere with thyroid function. Calcium promotes thyroid function. Vitamin D promotes it by letting you use the calcium. So you have to look at the whole picture, and protein, sodium, calcium are all things that increase your metabolic rate, and will help to, if it's just an inflammatory thing like a plugged milk duct, for example, the increased metabolic rate should clear it up quickly.
I'm so glad you brought up the PUFAs, because I think that so many people just think, okay, I'm going to take a thyroid supplement and I'm going to take an aspirin and take some progesterone and all my problems will go away. But you really do have to dial in the nutrition, and you have to look at the sources of those polyunsaturated fatty acids that are coming in, because they are anti-thyroid. So they're not going to help you any. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up as well. She has another question. What are Ray Peat's thoughts on alcohol, especially champagne?
In very small quantities, like half a teaspoon per day, it has very powerful anti-inflammatory and potentially anti-aging effects. There was a study of brain age pigment, or lipofuscin, and they found that the vitamin E caused it to be removed from the living cells. But as a control, vitamin E had been dissolved in alcohol. They found that just an alcohol supplement was enough to remove the age pigment from the brain cells. And that is probably because of its very powerful anti-inflammatory effect or antioxidant effect. But to achieve that, it's just a almost microscopic amount of ethyl alcohol that will serve as an antioxidant.
I'm just laughing because I'm thinking of all the people listening to this, that now their wine glass is going to have half a teaspoon of champagne in it.
Well, champagne is maybe 10% alcohol. Very small, somewhere between 8 and 10%, I think.
Yeah.
And so to have a gram of alcohol, you could have almost an ounce of champagne.
Well, thankfully I'm not a drinker, so it doesn't apply to me, but everybody out there, go get your little, teaspoon and measure out your champagne next time. So yeah. Okay. G Christy 626 asks, is the vitamin K2 in MCT oil safe? Some sources list MCT that can be derived from soy. What's the best way to get K2, particularly if supplementing with aspirin to prevent bleeding?
Many of the products are in MCT oil, and it depends on the person and the quantity, but orally ingesting MCT has the possibility of increasing sensitivity to allergens. For example, they found that you could create a peanut allergy by combining a little bit of MCT with a little bit of peanut substance. So it can have a very dangerous effect on the intestine. So I think it's good to avoid all of the oral supplements containing MCT. On the skin, as far as I know, they're safe. And so I when I think I've been, for example, taking antibiotics that would reduce the K-producing bacteria in my intestine, and using aspirin, which will inactivate the substances that are anti-inflammatory. To counteract that, I will either eat an extra amount of liver, or I will open some of the vitamin K capsules and spread 3 or 4 capsules on areas with thin skin.
Good idea. As far as when you say not taking MCT oils, though, so people really just need to get it from when they're using coconut oil, like you recommend, just getting the natural medium chain triglycerides from that. Yeah.
Many places call MCT a type of coconut oil, but it's really a totally unnatural thing that never occurs in nature, even though the components do, but they're arranged in a unique manufactured way and the arrangement has very powerful biological effects.
Okay, very good. Ellie Z asks, is supplemental calcium carbonate from undisclosed sources dangerous due to potential heavy metals, or do benefits outweigh the risk?
Yeah, it can come from a mine that contains very harmful amounts of heavy metals. So eggshells and coral are relatively clean. Eggshells were the cleanest by analysis, slightly better than coral calcium carbonate.
Okay, good to know. Dave Fit asks, would like to know about calcium to phosphorus ratio and maybe magnesium too. Dr. Peat talks a lot about getting lots of calcium, upwards of 2,000 plus milligrams a day, and talks about reducing phosphorus, but I've never heard where he'd like to see phosphorus intake. There is a decent amount of phosphorus in milk, so I'm curious what he recommends. New big fan of Ray Peat, he says.
Milk has, if you're drinking 2 or 3 quarts of milk a day, you're getting enough calcium. If your thyroid is functioning, a low thyroid person loses magnesium. The cells simply can't retain it very long. You might eat a huge batch of cooked spinach and have the symptoms subside for several hours or a day. But if your thyroid is low, your cells will lose it and the symptoms will recur. So you can get along on a surprisingly low level of magnesium if your thyroid is staying good.
Okay.
And milk is a very good source of magnesium if your thyroid is in good condition.
Okay, cool. All right, Dillrr, DYLRR asks, can Ray please talk about how an adult can grow taller after growth was stunted due to malnutrition? Is it possible, Dr. Peat?
Low thyroid people often don't finish growth until they're in their 40s, and malnutrition can be a major cause of low thyroid function. I didn't start taking a thyroid supplement, even though I suspected it for many years, but I had a high metabolic rate, and so I was close to, I think I was 40 when I started supplementing it. And when I had moved into that house, there were kids sharing the house, and everyone marked their height on a door frame. And after about 3 or 4 years after I had started taking the thyroid supplement, I was moving out, and I checked my height against the mark made 10 years earlier, and found that I had grown an inch after the age of 40 because of the thyroid supplement.
That's so great.
And I mentioned that to a tall woman just around the time I did in myself, and she said exactly the same thing happened to her. She grew an inch when she was 45.
Wow. All things are possible. Okay, so Laura Dana Nuclei asks, thank you for these shows. I love them, and you and Dr. Peat. Question, I cannot tolerate progesterone, and most things that are recommended, like aspirin, makes me really cold. And progesterone, even a small amount, even Progest-E, gives me a strong estrogenic reaction, lack of sleep, sore breast, long menses, etc. Same with pregnenolone, that gives me an allergic reaction. I'm following Ray Peat's work for quite a few years now, and most of the nutritional advice. I'm on thyroid support, and my temps and pulse are okay-ish. and getting better. Is there anything I can do to tolerate progesterone better? Main thing I want to do is improve working memory, especially with the capacity to focus and processing speed. I'm a 43-year-old woman with long-term iron deficiency. Thank you so much.
The iron deficiency diagnosis is usually mistaken because the iron stores tend to be hidden inside cells. And the closest you can get with a blood test is the transferrin saturation percent. And it should be something like maybe 25 to 30% is an okay saturation. But a low red blood cell count can be caused by many things, a copper deficiency, for example, or too much estrogen. If you look at female animals versus males, they always have a lower red cell count. And that's because estrogen inhibits bone marrow activity. And so often people poison themselves trying to cure iron deficiency anemia when it's really a thyroid supplement or trace minerals such as selenium and copper, or the B vitamins to get the red blood cell production up. The progesterone, by opposing that anemia producing effect of estrogen and by activating the thyroid gland, will itself improve the anemia, increasing red cell production in women. And the amount and way that you use progesterone is very important. In the oil form, it can be absorbed through the skin, but it's about 10 times more efficient if you take it orally. But since vitamin E is a very viscous oil, it tends to be at least a disgusting thing to swallow very much of. And it's better if you mix it with butter or other food so that you don't notice the consistency of it. And then it will express its progesterone-like activity. And progesterone, at every level, its basic activity is to antagonize estrogen. So as soon as you feel a progesterone effect, it is activating your thyroid gland, and an enlarged thyroid. That means that it's accumulating the material with which to make thyroid hormone, but it's unable to excrete it because your body is dominated by estrogen, which blocks the enzymes that break down the thyroglobulin, forming the hormone for secretion. And so if a person has a noticeably enlarged thyroid, it's better to shrink the thyroid gland back to the normal size, because occasionally, if a person takes enough progesterone to block that anti-thyroid effect of estrogen, the sudden release of the inhibition and the activating effect of the progesterone on those enzymes that release hormone from the thyroid globulin, that can put you into a hyperthyroid state, raising your pulse rate to 110 to 120 at rest until the gland normalizes itself. I experienced that myself, and I've seen it in 2 or 3 other people. And generally, they say that they never felt better in their life, but if they happen to go to a doctor, the doctor would want to destroy their thyroid gland to cure them.
Wow.
But if they just wait it out for a couple of months, it corrects itself.
Okay, another question from White Lotus is, are there any breads that are okay, like sourdough or rye?
If it's real sourdough,
Right.
and a lot of places just add acid to bread, but the actual way to make it nutritious and healthful sourdough is to soak the flour for 10 or 12 hours with or without the yeast. You could add the yeast later. It doesn't matter, because it's the soaking that turns the starch and protein, the gluten of the flour, and it has to be living flour. It can't be sterile flour. So it has to be vital with enzymes that can convert the gluten and starch into the amino acids and sugar that allows the yeast to leaven the bread. And so the bread loses its rubbery, fluffy texture. It tends to be denser and weak, but very good tasting and very, very non-toxic. 50 years ago, when I was interested in making bread, I had noticed that a single slice of bread from the grocery store would give me insomnia. But when I baked my own well-soaked sourdough bread, almost completely free of gluten, it tasted so good. I a couple of times ate a whole loaf of it at bedtime and slept perfectly.
I'm sure.
Very, very digestible stuff.
Yeah. I'm so glad I agree completely. If you can make it yourself or buy the highest quality fermented loaf of sourdough, then I think it's good. Okay, Julian says, Ray's thoughts on consistent nightly Benadryl usage for lowering serotonin and helping sleep and allergies. Thanks.
As far as I know, there's no specific harm done by it. It's something that you should consider a temporary crutch, because you can fix the problem of excess histamine and serotonin. For example, lowering your estrogen. Estrogen is the motor behind excessive histamine and serotonin activity. So getting the estrogen under control with thyroid, progesterone, vitamin D, and calcium, for example, will bring on sleep.
Sometimes I wish I had canned audience applause for you, because some of your answers are just so yay, we need canned audience applause. Okay. Joseph asks, options for people working through depersonalization panic disorder.
The panic part of it is from the falling blood sugar and excitatory effects of lactic acid. And the lactic acid is overproduced because you aren't making enough carbon dioxide to suppress the lactic acid production. And so making lactic acid blocks your ability to produce the sedative carbon dioxide and to keep your blood sugar up by the efficient oxidative metabolism. And so correcting your thyroid, a first aid can be inhaling carbon dioxide by rebreathing in a paper bag for a couple of minutes.
Okay. NC Girl 9fi asks, looking forward to the answer to my question. I've been following a Ray Peat diet for a year now. Raw carrot salad, milk, progesterone, and taking a little bit of thyroid. I'm still getting tension headaches, especially around menstruation. My doctor wants to put me on estrogen. Oh no. Is there anything else I should try first? Could this be high serotonin? Thanks, Dr. Peat.
Yeah, the important thing with progesterone use when you have a symptom like a menstrual headache or PMS or essentially any estrogen poisoning effect is to use the progesterone cyclically. The body produces it for 2 weeks every month and then lets up on the production. If your liver experiences a high level for more than 2 weeks, its enzymes are disposing of the estrogen as fast as you make it. And so you're losing the potency of the progesterone if you don't take a break of at least a week every month. And you get the most potent effect if you started partway through the luteal phase and use it with the intent of activating your thyroid and interfering with the estrogen effect. And you can use thyroid the same way, especially if you have the active T3 form of thyroid, such as cytomel or cynomel. And you can use that during the luteal phase when you have the symptoms to lower the estrogen. If you use too much of it, you'll lower the estrogen to the point where you stop menstruating. But for example, someone who has been hemorrhaging constantly couldn't turn off their menstruation. In just 2 or 3 days, they were able to absolutely turn off the menstruation by supplementing T3. And that's menorrhagia, or excessive menstruation, is a common sign of hypothyroidism. And to get your thyroid activity up, it requires good nutrition, a high ratio of calcium to phosphate, if possible. A 1-to-1 ratio is very good, but many people on a standard diet are getting 5 times as much phosphate as calcium, and that dissipates your energy, blocks the thyroid function, and so on.
For sure. Okay, so next one is from Vane R. Prestus. Ray has previously mentioned that being slightly hyperthyroid is preferable to being slightly hypo. What are the physical markers for a properly adjusted thyroid dosage for getting that, for that slightly hyperthyroid?
It's really hyper according to the standards of medical thinking.
Okay.
It's actually euthyroid condition,
yes.
Except good thyroid function is almost always considered as hyperthyroid by the medical doctrines that have developed over the last several years. And good thyroid function should include a resting pulse of somewhere in the 80 beats per minute, 80 to 85 beats per minute at rest, just to maintain all of your detoxifying functions, for example, at a high level. And your skin should be generally on the moist side. Your hair should accumulate an oiliness if you don't wash it for several days. The softness of the skin depends on adequate oil production and moisture from the sweat glands. High estrogen and low thyroid, for example, knock out the function of most of your sweat glands, leading to dry skin, thin skin, as well as internal problems of stress-related degenerative symptoms. And alertness, as well as alertness during the daytime, and quick onset of sleep at night. Many people find that when they're under stress or traveling or something and can't get to sleep, 5 to 10 micrograms of T3 by restoring the brain energy is creating the relaxed condition that will allow deep sleep to come on. It's partly a matter of the temperature, but partly simply activating energy production. And the brain is very similar to the muscles, which can't relax fully if you're hypothyroid. The secretory organs, which might either underfunction or overfunction. For example, excess salivation can happen from hypothyroidism. So having everything functioning optimally, having fairly quick transit time between eating food and excreting it, it should be on the order of 1 day, but the average American is 3 days transit time on average.
So glad you mentioned all those. That'll give people a good symptom picture to think about as far as like if you want to make sure you're where you need to be. So XR. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
The intestine should be sterile in a person with good thyroid activity. All of the secretions and peristalsis should be so active that no germ can live between your esophagus and your end of the small intestine where the colon begins. All of that should be free of bacteria. But the average American has a bacteria living partway up, at least in the small intestine. The lower your thyroid is, the more infested with bacteria your small intestine becomes.
Okay, very good. Okay, XR asks, what are Ray's predictions in the future regarding COVID and the vaccines? What will the vaccines cause, in his opinion?
They cause exactly the same kind of symptom that the infection does, often worse. And it's been known for decades that a viral infection, influenza, for example, or the other things that cause cold-like symptoms, that isn't just a respiratory condition, but it affects your digestive system. Often the first symptom is within your digestive system. And that's because of the interference with your anti-inflammatory processes of the viral infection, such as influenza or COVID. And the vaccine, so-called vaccine, is it's a method of producing the toxic part of the virus, the spike protein, which knocks out our anti-inflammatory ACE2 enzyme, which destroys angiotensin and knocks out inflammation of all sorts, and in the process restores metabolic activity because it has been suppressed by the inflammation. And so the lingering effects of the vaccine are going to be just about the same as the lingering effects of a viral infection have been. A certain percent, maybe only 1%, maybe several percent, will have lifelong recognizable problems resulting from an intense case of influenza, for example, or from a bad reaction to the vaccine.
Okay, last two questions here. We might kind of tag them together because Fab asks, is sugar as carcinogenic as we have been told, leading to cavities and tooth decay? And then Brandon also wants to know surrounding strategies to maintain oral health. It seems some people who transition from a low carb diet to a higher carb run into cavities. So having said that, does the pH of the mouth matter more than we think? So what about oral health, cavities and such, and sugar?
Yeah, your saliva should be antiseptic and a very neutral pH, very close to a 7 pH. And it has antibodies and probably other factors that help to keep the mouth sterile and prevent the acid-forming, tooth-destroying bacteria. But in the absence of that healthy saliva, which depends on high energy metabolism and good thyroid, you can protect your teeth to a great extent by having some water-dissolved baking soda at hand. And every time you eat something, swish a little bit of the baking soda solution in your mouth and swallow it to leave an alkalizing residue in the mouth. The story about cancer and sugar is a horrible misinterpretation of Otto Warburg's work in the 1920s, in which he showed that cancer can't turn off glycolysis by oxidizing glucose or other things to carbon dioxide, even in the presence of oxygen and the production of adequate energy. The cancer keeps turning glucose into lactic acid. Cancer has a metabolic effect of wasting glucose. And so the typical cancer is so metabolically inefficient that inside the tumor there is extreme lack of oxygen and glucose both. And in where there is an isolated cancer in a person's leg, for example, and in animal experiments, they found that if you put an extremely high concentration of glucose solution into the artery feeding the tumor, the making up for the glucose deficiency created by the cancer's metabolic inefficiency, getting enough glucose to the tumor dissolves, kills itself. So if you think of it in the actual detailed way that the metabolism is being operated, you see that glucose is one of the most protective oxygen, along with glucose. If you can provide it to the tumor in sufficient amounts, the tumor is going to gain the energy it needs to heal the wound. The cancer is an attempt to heal a tissue without the materials it needs to achieve the healing. And glucose is one of those materials. If you don't get enough glucose, the cancer sends out signals to provide more glucose. And to do that, if you aren't eating sugar, the only source of glucose in your body is to break down protein to turn to glucose. And so that's why having a tumor tends to produce wasting away of the muscles and the skin and the immune system and so on. And so having enough carbohydrate in your diet helps to prevent that wasting caused by cancer. And ideally, it can, along with other things, can provide the materials the tumor needs to heal itself.
Just another reason that we don't need to focus on low carb diets. So, well, we made it through all the questions, Dr. Peat. You were awesome. And this has been fun as usual. I love learning from you. So keep up what you're doing. And if you guys don't have Dr. Peat's newsletter yet, it's a great way to support him in the work that he does. So you can order that mailed order or emailed order of his newsletter by reaching out to Ray Peat's newsletter at gmail.com. And it's wonderful, chock full of wonderful information. I love every time I get it in my inbox. So Dr. Peat, thank you for your time today.
Okay, thank you.
Hope you have a wonderful evening. And you guys keep those questions coming and we'll be back with more. Bye for now.